If you're new to our channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
Let's get into 7 tips to a higher yield for our vegetable garden. Everybody wants to have a vegetable garden that produces endlessly and abundantly, but there's some steps in which we have to fulfill in order to have that requirement for the garden to give back to us.
So this is a big step, is building your soil, and when we talk about this, a lot of people have this misconception that you're going to feed your plant. You're going to give your plant food, and that's going to feed your plant.
That's hydroponics or aquaponics.
And that's even just some people decide that that's what they're going to do.
Right.
They buy plant food for their garden, and they feed their plants. So building your soil
takes a lot of the work out of it for you, and it's cheaper.
It is cheaper. And so there's a lot of things you can do. You can add organic matter, so you can add coffee grounds, you can add your own compost, you can add leaves in the fall, and you can add just compost you can purchase.
We want weed-free and chemical-free grass clippings. We want to mimic as close to possible as what nature does in the forest or in the prairie. In the prairie, if man's never been there, what happens in the summer, the plants grow. In the fall, they die back, they break down, they compost, they regrow again. They naturally feed the soil. And the plants are fed by nature, and then the earthworms and microbial life and the bacteria in the soil.
So we're going to go out
all
to
works
Ben
in
Bartley.
harmony
He
in
is
order
from
to
Standard
produce
Process Farms.
the
Standard
grasses or the
Process
plant
is
life
more
that's in the
trusted
prairie
whole
or in the
food
forest.
supplement
We want
manufacturer
to
for over
practice
90
and
years
mimic
to
that as much
identify
as
the best
possible
supplements for
in
you.
our garden,
Find
and
your
it will
local
return
healthcare
tenfold for
professional
us
today. Go to
if we can do that
standardprocess.com/patient.
in our backyard, front yard, wherever the case may be.
Right, so building your soil, we have videos on it, there's a lot of information online. Just feeding your soil so that it feeds your plants is going to give you a higher yield.
Let's talk about to maximize the space in our garden. Many of us grew up in the traditional row planting method, where we plant a row, make a foot space, plant another row, which that not necessarily requirements for backyard gardening.
Right, so there's this concept called the square foot garden method, and it's really great for your best use of space. So, for example, we're going to do real quick bush beans here.
Well, explain what square foot garden method is there.
So square foot garden method is you block your garden bed or whatever you're growing in off into 1 square foot
dimensions. Tiles,
essentially. And then you follow the method, like, for example, 16 radishes, 1 in a square foot, 1 tomato plant in a square foot, 2 pepper plants in a square foot.
16 carrots.
16 carrots. So it gives you, it's like 9 beets.
Yeah,
so it maximizes the space.
Yeah. So
if you maximize the space, that's going to give you bigger yield. So, for example, real quick here, bush beans.
We're talking in a dimension of 4 foot by 8 foot, 32 square feet. This is the mathematical equation that we have created here for you. If we was to do radishes versus a traditional row method, based on the back.
We're going to do bush beans.
Bush beans on the traditional row method, like it would be on the back of the seed packet, or practicing the square foot garden method. And pay attention to the numbers, because there's quite a difference here. So go ahead.
So in the same bed, 32 square feet, you plant 9 plants per square feet. That's going to give you 288 bean plants, as opposed to 4 rows with 4-inch spacing, 1 foot apart. That's going to give you 96 plants. That's a difference of 192 plants. So if you like beans, you're going to freeze them for winter or whatever, can them. That's a lot of different amounts of beans.
Yeah, we got 4 rows versus 32 squares of 9 beans per square. A bush bean plant, if continuing bush bean plants grow 40 to 60 days and bear fruit for about 2 to 3 weeks if you continue to harvest. And a bush bean plant will give you about a pint to a quart, upwards of a quart of beans over its growth cycle. So you figure that out. Knock off the ends, and when you can, you got quite a bit of beans growing in a 32 square foot area of your garden. So we want to utilize the space the best we can by looking at different alternatives instead of the traditional way in which we have normally gardened. And that's what we practice even on our in-ground garden. We don't have to do this in a raised bed. It can be in a grow bag, actually physically in the ground, and grid it off that way to maximize your space.
So one thing that, if you look at any nicely laid out urban garden with a proper use of space, is growing up into the air, using trellises, growing vertically, so that you get the plants off the ground. You're using that space to allow your plants to grow, but you're just trellising them. And trellising, so it's growing vegetables vertically, essentially. Trellising doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can get really creative with trellising.
Functional. It doesn't have to be pretty. Now, if you want aesthetics and all that, that's your deal. We find if it needs to be more functional than beautiful in our garden.
Definitely. So you can use anything from, we've used the sides of old baby cribs. The spring of old baby cribs.
Bottom part.
You can use fence posts and twine. You can use all sorts of things. You can use, maybe if you have some old branches, you can make like a teepee trellis. We've done that. Very creative.
There's some people that will take an old mattress and burn the mattress off and have that spring structure and actually use that as a trellis in their garden.
There you go. You can take things and wrap them around. You can take like cattle panels. If you don't know what cattle panels are, they're basically just like
large gauge metal squares that the agricultural industry uses to make pins for cows and hogs and sheep. You can get them in 8, 16-foot increments, and you can create trellises with those as well.
So there's definitely a lot of creative ways.
There's no wrong trellis.
No.
There's no wrong trellis.
Unless it falls over.
Yeah, you have to support your trellis because whatever you're growing is going to acquire weight, and you have to account for that in the long run of what you're going to put on there and how much stability is required to support them. And harvesting makes it a whole lot easier when you're doing cucumbers or you're doing pole beans or other climbing squash. You can pick it a lot easier rather than doing that search through the leaves and trying to find, and then you find a cucumber the size of a football that you've missed for 3 weeks. And we want to continue to harvest these crops, otherwise they will shut down and quit producing for us. And that's also a key to a high yield. Continually harvesting the produce on the plants that require that. If a pumpkin or whatever, you got to let it wait to maturity. Bush beans, pole beans, peppers, tomatoes, eggplants. You got to keep harvesting these things, otherwise they're not going to produce. Grow different crops. Some people want to grow a lot of one crop because you want to grow a variety of different crops. Some store longer than others. Some are very short shelf life, like leaf lettuce or spinach.
And I think with that being said is that a lot of times, typically, especially the Midwest, where we are, and versus like even Chicago area, Milwaukee, parts of Michigan, Minnesota, a lot of people get this idea in their head that you're just going to start growing Memorial Day through Labor Day, and that's not true. You have basically, kind of, depending on where you are, 2 months on either side of that,
right,
or a month and a half. Each.
Grow a variety of plants.
And think about how you can grow things sooner.
Right. And we always grow something. We try to grow something unique, something different. Even if it's a different variety of tomato or pepper or cucumber, we throw another one in there just to see, because there's so many hundreds of different varieties of these crops that one may be sweeter or more bitter than the other, and we either like it or don't like it. Plant succession planting. Now, some people may be new to the term of succession planting, Holly. What is the practice of that?
So succession planting is basically, instead of planting your entire crop at one time, you kind of variegate it throughout the season or for a couple weeks. So, for example, like beans, you would plant bush beans. Yep. You would plant bush beans maybe one row or one block 1 week, the next week plant another block, and that way you kind of have them available for harvest at different times.
Now, you obviously have to figure out when your first average frost date is in the fall, back off in the numbers of days that it takes for those plants to reach maturity, so you're not planting a crop that takes 60 days and your frost is 35 days away. So you have to do a little math there, but it works out well. And the actual benefit to that is if you have a crop failure, a week later you're planting another row of that same crop, so you're not it's not a one and done, I got to wait until next year type of situation. Stretching the seasons, we talked a little bit about this. On the early fall, the cool season crops in the spring and the fall, California can grow it in the winter, or winter here, and you can create low tunnels or high tunnels, frost covers to prevent or protect these plants.
Year-round gardening with, what are those things called?
High tunnels.
High tunnels, no, the little box things.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And slipped our minds.
Yeah, so you can look at year-round cold frames, year-round gardening, things like that. So there's ways you can stretch your season.
There is a gentleman in Chicago. He has a YouTube channel, 1 Yard Revolution, and he grows in Chicago, Zone 5, all year long in high tunnels, double tunnels in his greenhouse, a vast variety of leafy greens and root crops, and he's very, very successful at it. And he teaches us a lot, even though we only grow in the spring, summer, and fall. And finally, the one that everybody does not care much for is weeding. We must weed our garden because the weeds are more aggressive than the vegetables that we are growing and will overtake our crops. So by weeding, I don't mean just till them up or chop them off. We have to extract the roots from the soil, otherwise those roots will propagate and produce more vigorous plants. So by purging the beds from the roots, and it's a tedious process, but it's something you only have to do every so many years, and that's what I'm doing right now with our beds. If you follow us on social media, purging the beds of all the roots so the soil is clean. There's going to be some plant weeds that still come up, but if we can remove the majority of weeds, our plants are going to be so much more productive because they're not being competed by the weeds in which is in our garden.
Definitely, yeah. You want to make sure that you're not giving your plants competition, especially with weeds, and just be smart about it.
So that is just some of the multitude of tips that we can exercise for our garden to get a better yield when it comes to harvesting and growing. We want to have the best success that we can in our garden.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.